I'm Gilbert Cruz, and this is the Book Review Podcast. This week, I'm joined by Jonathan Eig, author of several biographies, including Luckiest Man, The Life and Death of Lou Gehrig, and Ali, A Life, about Muhammad Ali. His latest, King, A Life, takes on another American great, Martin Luther King Jr. In his piece for the Times Book Review, our critic Dwight Garner wrote that the book, which he calls the new definitive look at MLK, was, quote, supple, penetrating, heartstring pulling, and compulsively readable. Jonathan spoke to us from his home in Chicago. Jonathan, thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
You've written several biographies of famous men. So how do you decide who you're doing next? How do you arrive at this point in your career when you say, I'm going to do one of the big ones?
You know, I don't have an answer for that. I'm following what I'm most interested in. I'm following curiosity and passion, and also looking for things that haven't been done or where there's something new to say. That's really important, because there are plenty of great biographies that really closed the door, at least for a while. And I thought, wow, it'd be great to write about so-and-so, but that book came out 5 years ago and it's excellent and there's no room for another one yet. So you've got to sort of think about it strategically too. In the case of Martin Luther King, I had found that I was talking to people who knew King, and that just excited me. And then when I looked to see when the last King biography had been published, I was shocked to see that the last straightforward, cradle to grave biography was 35 years ago, Stephen Oates' book. And there have been several great books in the meantime, but not biographies. So it really just sort of checked off the boxes. Over time, I've learned that there are boxes you've got to check off.
In the introduction to your book, you write, quote, in the process of canonizing King, we've defanged him, replacing his complicated politics and philosophy with catchphrases that suit one ideology or another. What were you trying to accomplish with another look at the life of this great man, albeit the first one in decades?
Well, part of the reason I felt like we needed a new King book is not just because it had been a while, but also because in that time, we've really rendered him in this sort of watered down fashion, and the national holiday has contributed to that. And the way we teach King in schools has contributed to that. We start out with I Have a Dream, and we don't get much more sophisticated than that. And in the process, we lose sight of him as a human being. And that's one of the things biography can do really well. It can focus the lens on the individual and then broaden out to look at what's happening in society and how he's changing the world. But I wanted to write a more intimate book, something that would remind us that he was a man, that he had feelings, that he had doubts, that he struggled, and also that he was more courageous and more radical than we've really depicted him in recent years.
Biographies are a major genre of nonfiction writing. I know a ton of people who read primarily biographies, and particularly the biography of the major historical figure. It's often a great man because of the way that American history, at least, has gone. I'd love you to walk us through, how do you do something like this? You've done it so many times. Like, literally, how do you start? Where do you start with someone as big as Martin Luther King Jr. or Muhammad Ali?
It's pretty simple, really. You start with the interviews. At least in my case, I'm lucky enough to have people still alive who knew these men. I start there because they're getting older, of course, and they might not make it to the end of the book, sadly. So I began, in the case of both King and Ali, with interviewing almost, by the actuarial tables, who's the oldest and who's the frailest. And let me start there. I hate to be morbid about it, but that's the truth. And I'm recording these interviews, knowing that this might be the last chance. And in this case, I was really fortunate to get started before COVID hit and to go visit a lot of King's closest friends and associates who are still with us. And then when COVID hit and they were stuck at home, I was able to call them and stay in touch. And it was actually lovely to have this access at a time when people were homebound, to be able to pick up the phone and talk to them sometimes, several times a week. And at the same time I'm doing that, I'm also looking for the new archival materials. What wasn't available? What's been donated to libraries or discovered or released by the FBI since Taylor Branch and David Garrow did their books 20 some odd years ago. And that turned out to be a much bigger cachet of documents and materials than I expected to find. You'd think somebody like King has been picked over pretty well by all the scholars, but I found really important, giant new sources of materials. So that's where I begin. And reading, of course, as much as I can.
I have a lot of questions about previously untapped archives, but let's stick with the interviews for a moment. In your acknowledgments, you talk about the key people that you wanted to reach out to first. One of them, of course, was Harry Belafonte, who died a couple months ago. What was that like? How did you reach out to him? How did he respond? And what was the conversation or conversations you had?
Well, first of all, some of these folks are hard to reach. They're famous and they have gatekeepers. So I sent a letter to Belafonte's secretary. And then one day my phone rang. I caller ID, and I answered it. And there's Harry Belafonte on the other line saying, I think you have a good idea for a book. I'm not going to attempt to do the imitation of his beautiful, raspy voice.
Wise choice.
So, and then he invited me to come to his house, where I spent 3.5 hours in his living room. And it was just beautiful. He was just the kindest guy. Hanging on his wall, I think it was a 4-page handwritten speech that King had worked on while staying with Belafonte. Belafonte said he had fished it out of the garbage can. It was a draft of one of his earliest anti-Vietnam War speeches. And I said to Belafonte, can I take a picture of that? And he said, sure, just take it off the wall and bring it over by the window. And I said, no way, I'm not touching that. And he's 90 years old. He gets up off the couch and grabs one end of this framed picture, says, take the other end. And we took it off the wall, marched it over the window, took pictures. And that was scary because I figured that thing was worth millions of dollars. But Belafonte was lovely. And, so many of the people who knew King well, like Juanita Abernathy and King's childhood friend June Dobbs Butts and his barber in Montgomery, they were all, I don't know, I guess maybe having been touched by King, they were all just incredibly loving and welcoming and encouraging for this project.
So you mentioned briefly the archival dives that you did. I mean, there's a lot here that you were able to access that was not available before. As you say, thousands of recently released FBI documents, various official telephone recordings, oral histories, but also, interestingly, thousands of pages from King's personal archivist, as well as what must have been amazing audio tape recorded by Coretta Scott King that had not really been accessed before. There's a lot there, but I'm just curious about what it was like to look for those things, find those things, and then try to distill them into a book.
That's so much fun for me. I love these dives. I was a newspaper reporter for a long, long time and, working on daily stories. If you got 5 days to work on a story, it was a luxury. Now I've got 5-6 years to work on a story and I take full advantage of that. Sometimes it takes me 6-8 months just to get the archives to look to see what they've got. It took me 2 years to find, even though I knew it was out there, this unpublished autobiography that Martin Luther King's father wrote. Nobody had ever quoted from it. I knew it was out there. And the library that had it didn't know they had it. And it took me more than a year just to convince them that they had it. And if they really looked, they could go find it. So stuff like that just gets me really, really pumped up. But then, just to get into the weeds a little bit. So I find the papers of King's personal archivist, as you mentioned, Lawrence Dunbar Reddick. They're at the Schomburg Library in Harlem, but they haven't been opened yet. Nobody has seen these boxes. They've only been donated recently and they hadn't gotten around yet to processing them. So there's no finding aid, there's no index, there's no way to sort through it. So I, along with my friend Lori Azim, who lives in Brooklyn and I'm in Chicago, she was able to get there more often, just went in and photographed the entire collection and helped the library figure out what they had as they began the process of properly indexing it. So we had first look at it all. And then I've got to sort it and tag it and make it searchable, share it with other historians so that they can help me understand what's in there and what's important. And then, as you say, somehow begin to think about how is this actually going to work into the book. It's a monumental project, just that one archive alone.
There was recently a documentary entitled Turn Every Page about Robert Caro and his editor. I believe that quote was just taken from something Robert Caro had said in one of his books about the advice that he was given early on in his career when he worked as a journalist at Newsday before he started writing his Lyndon Johnson books. Are you turning every page in this archive that is not tagged and taking pictures with a phone?
Pretty much. I don't really believe that it's possible, even for Robert Caro, and even if you live into your 90s, I don't believe it's possible to turn every page in the LBJ archives or in the MLK archives. You've got to be selective. But I try to be as thorough as I can, and certainly in the folders that I think are relevant to King, I'm photographing every page, and then Lori and others are helping me to tag it so that I can search for it later. Because even if you turn every page, how are you going to remember what you saw if you're photographing and processing and dropping into Google Drive, tens of thousands of pages? You've got to have some kind of a more efficient method than that. And it's tough because I'm one guy with one brain trying to write a book of 500 some odd pages that's based on tens of thousands of pages of documents that I'm assembling. So there's no easy, smart, efficient way to do it.
I feel like biographers often have a handful of stories about a revelatory moment when they have found a particular document or one source that they never thought was going to get back to them finally gets back to them. You might have a couple of those stories, and I'd love to hear one.
One was this discovery of Coretta Scott King's audio tapes that she made just months after the assassination. I had seen several books that mentioned this interview that she had done with the editor who worked on her book, her first memoir, which was published just the year after the assassination. So I went looking for the notes from those interviews, and I found that the ghostwriter's papers, the editor who worked with Coretta Scott King, her papers were at the University of Florida. So I looked at the finding aid for her collection, and it didn't say anything about Coretta Scott King in the finding aid. I thought that's odd because we know that she worked with Coretta Scott King on the memoir. Instead of giving up, I called the archivist at the library at University of Florida, and I said, "Do you have the papers connected to her work with Coretta Scott King?" And he said, "Yes, we do." And I said, "Why aren't they on the finding aid? Why aren't they listed on your website?" And he said, "Well, because the family gave us a hard time and they wanted those papers, but they never got around to asking for us again. So we just took them off of the website because we were waiting to hear back from the family." And I said, "Are there any tapes by any chance that go along with those transcripts?" And he said, "Yeah, we've got tapes of the interviews that she did with Coretta Scott King." And I said, "Can I come to the library in Florida and listen to them?" He said, "You don't have to. I just emailed them to you." So that was beautiful. It took me a few months to find out where those tapes were, but it took me a few seconds to actually get the tapes in my inbox.
You've been able to give a deeper portrait of Coretta Scott King, as well as many of the other Black women that were in King's orbits. Certainly a deeper portrait than has been able to be drawn in previous works. What was it like to shift your focus a little bit to those characters, those famous historical figures in their own right, even though this is a biography about this man?
One reason you need a new biography of our key figures every generation, at least, is that, our view of the world changes. And it's easy to see why women were neglected in some of the earlier King biographies. And it's easy to see why their contributions were overlooked. They were overlooked by the men in their lives at the time. So it's taken a while for our historians to begin to recognize what was missed. In the case of Coretta, though she told her story several times, there has not yet been a great Coretta Scott King biography, and I'm hoping somebody will get to work on one. And I'd be happy to share the tapes if you can't get them yourself from the library. I felt like it was essential to understanding King and also to understanding King's flaws. The fact that he was married to this brilliant, powerful woman who had more experience than he had as an activist, and yet he overlooked her contributions and really insisted that she stay home and raise the kids when she wanted to take a more active role. I mean, that's just great personal family drama. And to understand King is to get away from just the marches, to get away from just the public part of his life, but to look at the private part of his life. And that was a really complicated part of his life.
Were there any members of the extended members of the family at this point that you had to talk to, access, run stuff through? What was the relationship with whatever's left of King's family?
Well, his children, he has 3 surviving children. They did not respond to my requests for interviews. But his nieces and nephews and cousins did. Many of them talked to me. And they were quite interested, especially as I learned more about their ancestry. I made some discoveries that they were not aware of in terms of where the King family had been forced into sharecropping. And I discovered the white family that they had sharecropped for. I made some connections. And those members of the King family were very interested in some of that research. And also the fact that I discovered this unpublished Daddy King autobiography and shared that immediately with members of the family.
Can you talk a little bit about that Daddy King autobiography? Because the early chapters of your book give quite a lot of depth to King's father.
I think Daddy King, as everybody called him, was one of the great figures in American history, a man whose life is worthy of an opera, because he's literally sharecropping up to age 12 and walks off the farm barefoot with his shoes slung over his shoulders so as not to wear them out, and walks to Atlanta into a new life and is determined that he's going to make better for himself and for the next generation. And it's Daddy King who makes it possible for Martin Luther King Jr. to do everything he does. Daddy King basically teaches himself to read, teaches himself how to preach, marries into this more established preacher's family, and takes over Ebenezer Baptist Church and sees his job as to save souls, but also to save society, to fight racism, and raises Martin Luther King Jr. to do something that he could only dream of.
One of the discoveries that you made got a bunch of press a bit ago. I'd love for you to walk our listeners through the situation with Alex Haley and Malcolm X.
Well, anytime I find a really good interview with one of my subjects, I go to the source. I try to find the original interview, the tapes, the transcripts of the interviews, the notebooks. For example, David Halberstam did a great piece on Martin Luther King in 1966, I think it was. I went to Halberstam's archives and got his notebooks. And there was this lovely incident in there where he describes Martin Luther King taking his kids swimming, and one of the kids scrapes her knee. And King, rubs the knee, the bloody knee, with a piece of fried chicken and says, "That's the best thing. Don't you know that's the best thing for a scrape?" And it's just a way of distracting his kid, like we've all done a million times. And it's just a beautiful little detail. So I went looking for the archive of Alex Haley, because Alex Haley did the longest interview we have with Martin Luther King. He did it for Playboy magazine. When I got a copy of the transcript of the interview, Duke University's library had the original transcript of the tape. Then it had the typed version that Haley submitted to Playboy. And then, of course, we have the published version. So I compared the three documents. And King's most famous comment about Malcolm X, the one that is quoted most often, that's been repeated in history books, that's taught in all of these history lessons, was not in the original transcript. Alex Haley had fabricated it. And it's a really important quote, because King is basically saying that in his litany of articulating the despair of the Negro without offering any positive creative alternatives, I feel that Malcolm has done us a great disservice. His fiery demagogic oratory brings nothing but pain. And that's not at all what King said. King said that in response to a question about the Nation of Islam, not about Malcolm X. And when asked about Malcolm X, King actually said, "I don't think I have all the answers. I think Malcolm and I have a lot more to learn from each other," basically. So it's a huge, important correction of history, I think.
And how does it make you feel as a biographer when all it takes is changing the tape to the transcript to the final interview for one of the most important quotes in a person's life to be completely mangled?
Well, it reminds me that I have a pretty awesome responsibility not to screw it up and doom future generations to incorrect information. It also reminds me of the very first lesson that I got in journalism school. If your mother says she loves you, check it out.
I also got that lesson. I text my mother all the time just to make sure.
That's good. Give her a call, though.
We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Book Review Podcast. I'm Gilbert Cruz, and I'm joined this week by Jonathan Eig, author of several major biographies, including his latest, King A Life. Jonathan, I know that there are more FBI transcripts that are due to be released in several years. Is that 2027?
That's right, yes.
What do you think might be revealed in there? And were you at all concerned that you're putting a book out in 2023 and maybe a few years later there might be some major revelations in these archives?
Yes, I was a little concerned, but I felt like I didn't want to wait, and who knows if it's going to be worth the wait. We have transcripts of most of the FBI wiretaps, and there's more being released every year, so I'll keep tabs on that, of course, as they come out. We know that the transcripts, as we've got them, are most likely accurate. People who were in those conversations and read the transcripts say that they're accurate. Andrew Young, Bayard Rustin, they read the transcripts of their own conversations and they say the FBI is transcribing them accurately. So the tapes will certainly reveal more detail. In some cases, the tapes might shed light on the memos that we've got from the FBI. Those are definitely subject to more scrutiny. Is the FBI describing accurately in its memos what they're hearing in their surveillance of King? That we'll get a better sense of that. And certainly some of the more lurid scenes that the FBI has described of King's relations with women, we may have some light shed on that when the tapes are released. But I felt like it was important to do this book now, to get it out as quickly as possible and not wait. Who knows? There are some people who are trying to stop the release of those tapes in 2027. So I wanted to just deal with what I had now, which was plenty of material to work with.
In 2019, the FBI released records detailing its audio surveillance of King. Some of that was used in a movie, maybe you saw a documentary, MLK FBI, that I thought was pretty gripping by a very good documentarian. What was in those documents that you were able to access?
That's the same batch of documents that I've had access to. There have been another 2 rounds of releases since that terrific documentary. Those documents have revealed a lot more of the details of King's conversations with his private advisors. Some of the stuff we get from that is conversations about strategy. Some of it is about King's own personal woes, about his mental health. We hear his advisors talking about their concern that he's close to collapse, close to a breakdown. And we hear King, or I shouldn't say hear, we read the transcripts of these conversations with King on the phone with women other than Coretta, with whom he seems to be engaged in romantic affairs. So that's the substance of it. To me, what was most important wasn't the lurid details. To me, what was most important was the way it was weaponized by the FBI. And we've learned a lot more about just how aggressive the FBI was, and that it wasn't just J. Edgar Hoover, that it was high-ranking members of the Bureau, that it was the president himself, LBJ, who was encouraging this activity, encouraging the FBI to release this to the press, and that members of Congress knew about it, members of the media knew about it. So to me, that's the important piece of all this new information.
You started as a journalist. What was it like for you to see, and again, we could always say it was a different time, the press really reject, in a way, these FBI leaks? The major press did not pick this up in the way that the government really want them to.
It was interesting to me, and I knew a couple of the reporters who were covering the White House and covering the civil rights movement back at the time, and I've interviewed some of them, and they didn't take the bait that J. Edgar Hoover and LBJ wanted them to take. They didn't report King's sex life. Mostly, I actually think that was just because of the standards of the day. I think they knew that if they reported on King, there would be no excuse for failing to report on the president's personal life, on the mayor's personal life in their towns they're writing about, or about the editors of the newspapers themselves. This was the standard of the time, was to protect the privacy of authority figures who were not leading personal lives of purity. But at the same time, I think we need to ask, why didn't any of these reporters decide that there was a bigger story here? Why didn't they write about the FBI's surveillance of a private citizen? Why didn't they write about this vast network of surveillance that was being used to try to divide and conquer the civil rights movement? I think that was a bigger story, and I think they blew it on that front.
We talk so much now about the surveillance state and how technology makes it so easy for the government to read our emails, listen to our phone calls, et cetera, but this really is one of the earliest occasions of the government engaging in wide surveillance like this, and it really draws an amazing parallel between then and now.
It does, and I think we need to consider why and who they were picking on, because it became clear pretty quickly that this was not a threat to democracy in terms of communist infiltration of the civil rights movement. That was their original pretense for seeking the wiretaps. So once they say that there's clearly no real communist influence on King or the civil rights movement, why does it continue? Why are they so obsessed? And I think it's because J. Edgar Hoover correctly recognizes that this is a threat to the establishment, to the power structure. And the power structure, in his view, does not have any room for Black people, that he wants the status quo to remain as it is, which is basically a country led by white Christianism.
I think that's another thing that your book tries to do in resetting us and reminding us that King was very human. He had a lot of problems, but he also was incredibly dangerous to the government and the power structure at the time, which, when all you know is I Have a Dream and Letter from Birmingham Jail and the Monument and The Day, maybe you forget.
That's right. And just months before King's assassination, the FBI sends a memo, call it the Messiah memo, to every bureau office saying that we must be alert that King, more than anyone, has the power to unite the Black community. Malcolm X has been assassinated by this point. Stokely Carmichael and others are seen as too fringy, too radical. But King, because he has the power to speak to the mainstream, because he has the ear of white audiences, the support of white Northern liberals, he is the biggest threat. Not that he has the greatest opportunity to enhance our democracy, which is how some people might have seen it. No, our government, the FBI, is saying he poses the greatest threat to the establishment, to the white power structure. And that's because, in a way, Hoover is correctly reading Martin Luther King. He understands that King is calling for a reevaluation of American democracy, a more fundamentally equal system of justice and economics. He's willing to consider vast reforms to make that happen. And that scares a lot of people.
You said you wanted to present a more intimate and humanistic view of King in this book. How practically do you do that? In the writing, in the style, and the decisions of what to put in, what not to go on at length about?
Well, I figured for one thing, great books like Taylor Branch's trilogy and David Garrow's Bearing the Cross are really books that focus on the movement with King playing a major role. I wanted to focus on King with the movement in the periphery, and that I didn't need to cover every march. I didn't need to cover every legislative battle. I wanted you to feel King. I wanted you to be in the car with him and ride along with him on this journey. And I want you to see how he's suffering at times and see how he's feeling doubt, see how this campaign by the FBI is affecting him personally and hurting his relationships. That's just a different framing. It's just a different, focus of the camera, really.
Have you learned anything from biographies that try to do it differently than just going chronologically from start to front? I remember Edmund Morris, who did a 3-volume biography of Teddy Roosevelt, wrote a biography of Edison, maybe? Does it go backwards, I think?
Yeah,
is
right.
possible. And then, you have group biographies, you have biographies that zoom in instead of zooming out. What do you learn from other types of approaches to a person's life?
Yeah, I've learned don't do that backwards thing.
I think everyone learned that.
Yeah. I have one book that was a group biography. It's called The Birth of the Pill. It's about the invention of the birth control pill, and it's got 4 main characters. And it's really hard. It's definitely the toughest book when it comes to writing for me. The structure of it was really tough because you've got to flashback. You've got to introduce all 4 people, and they grew up in different times in different places. And it's not until almost halfway into the book that the chronologies merge and that they're in the same place at the same time. It's really difficult. That's why I said earlier, I think for someone like me, biography is a really easy way into the book writing business because you really better not mess around with that chronology unless you're sure you know what you're doing.
What do you think a great biography does that a less great biography does not?
Wow. I think the great biographies not only take you inside someone else's world and give you a kind of radical sense of empathy, but they also expand your understanding of the world around you now so that you're reading it in 2 times in a way. I hope when people read my book, I know when they read a great biography by T.J. Stiles, who's one of my favorites, or, Laura Hillenbrand, you're reading it in your own time and in the time that the subject is living. And that is also a kind of radical empathy and a kind of time travel. And I think there's magic in that.
One of the more interesting things I read about your process working on this book over many years was that David Garrow, who wrote a Pulitzer-winning biography in 1986, Bearing the Cross, he opened up his files to you. He was very generous in his assistance and giving you access to what he had. What was that like? And that doesn't seem very common, or does it?
David Garrow is unusual in that if you're a junior high school student working on your history fair project and you call him, he'll open up his files to you too. And he'll spend countless hours working with you. But I was nervous about it. And in fact, when I did my first book, my Lou Gehrig biography, I was scared to call Ray Robinson, who had written an earlier Gehrig biography. And then when my book was out, he called me and he said, "Why didn't you call and ask for help? I've got files that I could have shared with you." And I felt like an idiot because I was scared of calling him. So I've learned to be bold, and I will someday certainly return the favor because biographers, I think, are, for the most part, historians in general. We all share the same interest in getting these stories out and increasing understanding of our subjects. And, not everybody, but I think many of them have that sense of community.
One of the things that Garrow was able to pull from some files, and he asserts this, and you cast some doubt on it, is an incident in which King may have been present for an act of violence against a woman. Was that awkward? You used his files and then you said, well, maybe this thing that he wrote his Pulitzer Prize winning book was, I don't know about that.
Well, I think, again, it's a strong community and we can talk about these things. And Garrow and I talked about it. And I also did further research as time went on. He made this discovery. He's the first one to see those files that showed that the FBI had a memo with a handwritten note in the margin saying that King may have been a witness and may have been in the room at this time of this assault. We begin by noting that it's only a handwritten note in the margin written by people who are trying to please J. Edgar Hoover. We know that, and Garrow acknowledges that. From there, I went on and talked to Justice Department officials who had heard some of those tapes, and they did not say they had heard anything like that. Doesn't mean that it wasn't there, just means they haven't heard it yet. We won't know till 2027. So I think, my instinct is the presumption of innocence until proven guilty, and we will perhaps know something more in 2027.
Is there anything you tried to get access to or any sources that you, other than the King children, that you reached out to that you really, it hurts a little that you weren't able to get to it or to them?
There was really only one key figure who didn't want to speak to me, and that was Diane Nash. And we talked about it. And she just feels like, understandably, I think, that there's too much focus on King, that others in the movement deserve to have their stories told, and that the King-centric view of the civil rights struggle is not the one that she wants to keep reinforcing. But the biggest thing that taunted me, my white whale, is the blue suitcase. Supposedly, Coretta Scott King kept a blue Samsonite suitcase under her bed with all of the most personal letters from her husband. And that suitcase continues to elude me. Maybe one of the King children has it today. Maybe someday it will emerge. And when it does, that will be potentially a game changer.
Jonathan, I'd love to close by asking what your favorite biographies are and what you would like to recommend to our readers.
Oh, wow. Well, I mentioned I'm a fan of T.J. Stiles, and I am a fan of Jean Theo Harris's recent work in civil rights. Not all of it's straight biography, but she's terrific. I'm looking around my shelf to think about it.
I see you looking up at your shelves there.
I don't like doing this because I'm going to leave out people, and it's painful to me, and I wasn't prepared for this question. So
this is not comprehensive.
Okay,
Just say one or two great biographies with the acknowledgement that there are many.
All right. Well, I mentioned the role of Laura Hillenbrand in launching my book writing career, so Seabiscuit is definitely an all-time favorite. I got to throw out some sports, too. Jane Levy, one of my favorite baseball writers.
Can I ask you about T.J. Stiles? I was in my friend's wedding right out of college, and as a gift to all his groomsmen, he gave us all books, and he gave me a T.J. Stiles biography that, I'm sorry, Heath, I have not yet read, but is still on my shelf. What are the ones that we should dip into?
I think all of his books are terrific. The Jesse James book is one of his earlier ones. The Custer book is fantastic. I think what makes him so good is that he asks a lot of hard questions. He's not just relying on the past. He's offering analysis. He's really strong on economics. He's just reinterpreting these lives while still doing the hardcore scholarship.
You're about to go out on a mini tour for your book through the South and other parts of the country. Do you have a sense already what your next project is going to be, or are you taking a little breather?
I'm not taking a breather. I'm aggressively looking for the next book idea. So I hope people will give me suggestions because I haven't landed on one yet. I've got a few ideas that I'm kicking around, but you got to take your time and really be sure because it's, at least a 5 or 6 year commitment and you don't want to jump in and then regret it. So I'm going to be careful.
Jonathan Eig, author of King a Life, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you.
That was my conversation with Jonathan Eig, author of King a Life. I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review. Thank you for listening.